Listen, the land doesn't lie. It doesn't care about your bank balance or your 5-year plan. It just is. It gives you what it gives and it takes back what it wants. I learned that lesson a long time ago, the hard way, with cracked hands and a heart full of dust. But there's another lesson I'm still wrestling with. It's about the living things on that land, the critters with fur and feathers, the ones that seem like they're just another part of the scenery. See, for most of my life I looked at them in terms of numbers. How many head of cattle can I run? How much will the predators cost me? It was a cold, calculated equation that kept the ranch afloat. That's how it's done. That's how you survive. Then came the winter that broke the thermometer and the spring that followed, so full of death it felt like a curse. It's funny what a man will do when he's staring into the face of a loss so complete it takes the breath from his lungs. It can make you hold on tighter to what you've got, or it can make you realize you ain't got much at all. I made a choice that spring, a choice that went against every business instinct I had. My neighbor, Old Man Jenkins, he called me a fool. My own daughter, God bless her, she just looked at me with those big, scared eyes and asked me, "Why, Daddy?" I didn't have a good answer for her then. I just felt like I had to do it. Like the land itself was telling me that this one time the numbers didn't matter. I chose a path that would bleed my bank account dry, a path of compassion over profit, and I braced myself for the fallout. But I didn't know then, not in a million years, that the land had a way of settling its own debts, and what it gave back to me in return for a simple act of mercy. Well, it changed everything. It was the kind of cold that gets into your marrow, a deep, bone-aching chill that even the thickest wool and a roaring fire can't quite shake. The spring of '87 had been a bastard. We'd had the worst calving season in 30 years, a brutal winter that just wouldn't loosen its grip. The snow had melted a week ago, but the ground was still a soggy, treacherous mess of mud and half-frozen slush. The cattle were weak, the hay was almost gone, and I felt the weight of every single debt I owed pressing down on my shoulders like a physical yoke. I was out on the North 40, checking the fence line that ran along Eagle Creek. The creek was running high with the melt, a roiling, muddy torrent that was eating away at the banks. I was on my horse, a stubborn old bay named Rusty, when I saw it, a flash of dark brown, a tangle of legs, and the panicked, desperate sounds of an animal in deep distress. I pulled up Rusty, my heart sinking into my stomach. I knew that sound. There, caught in the jaws of a rusty, abandoned beaver trap that some trapper had left behind decades ago, was a cow, but not one of mine. She was a range cow, a wild one, part of the feral herd that roamed the foothills. The ranchers around here, we tolerated them. They were tough, scrawny things, and they got by where our purebreds couldn't. But they were a menace, too. They'd compete for grazing, spread disease, and the bulls would sometimes get loose and mix with our herds, ruining the bloodlines. The unwritten rule was simple. A wild cow was a problem to be solved, usually with a rifle. She was a sorry sight. Her leg was caught in the trap's steel jaws, the bone clearly snapped. The flesh was raw and torn, and the mud around her was stained a dark, sickly red. She had been there a while, maybe a day or two. Her eyes were wide with a terror that was beyond animal instinct. It was the pure, unadulterated fear of a creature facing a slow, agonizing death. I could see the ribs protruding under her matted, mud-caked hide. She was too weak to even struggle anymore. She just lay there, her sides heaving, her head barely lifted off the ground, her low, guttural moans a plea to the indifferent sky. My first thought was pragmatic, a mercy killing, put her out of her misery and save myself the trouble. The rifle in my scabbard felt heavy, a familiar and welcome weight. It would be quick, clean, and over. That was the right thing to do. That's what any good rancher would do. You don't let an animal suffer, and more importantly, you don't waste resources on a feral pest that's gonna cost you more than it's worth. But as I sat there on Rusty, looking down at her, I felt a pull, a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. I tried to shake it off. I thought about the vet bill, the antibiotics, the endless weeks of nursing her back to health. I thought about my wife, Bate, and how she'd been worried sick about our finances. We were barely making it as it was. We didn't have the money to be a charity for every stray animal that stumbled onto our land. Every dime I spent on her was a dime I wouldn't have to buy hay or pay the bank. But then I saw her eyes again. They were locked on mine. It wasn't just fear anymore. There was something else in them, a spark, a stubborn, defiant will to live that was so fierce it took my breath away. It was the same look I'd seen in the eyes of my father when he was dying of cancer, refusing to let go. It was the look of a fighter. I dismounted, my boots sinking into the mud with a wet, sucking sound. I walked slowly toward her, my hands held out, palms open. "Easy, girl," I said, my voice a low murmur. "Easy now." I don't know why I said it. It felt ridiculous talking to a wild animal, but it was just something you did. Her eyes flicked to me, and a fresh tremor of fear went through her, but she was too exhausted to even try to get up. I knelt in the mud beside her, the cold seeping through the knees of my jeans. I looked at the trap. It was a heavy, old-fashioned thing with teeth that were rusted and cruel. I knew what I was looking at. It wouldn't be an easy thing to get off. I reached out, my hand hovering over her flank. She flinched, her whole body tensing. I talked to her again, nonsense words, the same way I talked to Rusty when he was spooked. It took a long time, but eventually her tense muscles relaxed, just a fraction. I placed my hand on her side. She was thin, so thin I could feel every rib. Her coat was rough and infested with ticks. She was a mess. I pulled my hand back and looked at the situation. I had nothing with me, no tools, no rope. I was a good 15 miles from the ranch house. It would take me hours to get back, get my truck and the right equipment and come back. She might not last that long. The simplest solution was still the most obvious one: put her down. It was the humane thing to do. It was the responsible thing to do. It was the smart thing to do. I stood up, wiping the mud off my knees. I walked back to Rusty and pulled the Winchester from the scabbard. The cold steel felt right in my hands. I worked the lever, the familiar click-clack echoing in the quiet morning. I turned back to face her. The sound had made her jump. She tried to get up, to scramble away, but her broken leg gave out and she collapsed back into the mud with a pitiful yelp. Her eyes were on me again, those deep, dark pools of fear and life. They weren't pleading. They were just watching, waiting for me to do what I had to do. She knew what was coming. She had accepted it. That's what broke me. I couldn't do it. I just couldn't. I lowered the rifle, the barrel pointing to the ground. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I had to fight the urge to be sick. The weight of what I was about to do settled on me. It wasn't just about her. It was about the principle of it. For the past few months, everything had been about numbers, about cutting corners, making do, and surviving. I had become a bookkeeper in a cowboy hat. When did I stop being a steward of the land and start being just another businessman grinding his way to the bottom? I leaned the rifle against a fence post. It felt like a betrayal, leaving it there. I went to Rusty and untied the coiled rope from the saddle horn. I had a small knife in my pocket. It was a pathetic plan, but it was the only one I had. The trap was ancient and probably rusted shut. A strong man might be able to pry it open with a heavy steel bar. I didn't have a bar. I had a rope and a pocket knife. It was crazy. It was stupid. It was gonna cost me more than I could afford. I got down on my knees in the mud again. She watched me, her breathing shallow and rapid. I could smell her now, a sour scent of fear and infection. I talked to her, a constant, low stream of words. I told her she was going to be okay. I promised her she was going to live. I didn't know if I was lying to her or to myself. I looped the rope around the top jaw of the trap and then around the bottom. I tied a knot, a simple bowline, the one my father had taught me. It was about all I could manage with my shaking hands and numb fingers. The trap is frozen in the mud. I muttered to myself, a grim assessment. Gotta free it first. I got to work, using my knife to dig around the mechanism, prying at the thick, clumpy soil that had solidified around the iron. The mud was a cold, clinging paste that worked its way into my gloves and up my sleeves. My hands were getting numb. I was covered in filth. My knees were screaming. She watched me the whole time. Her low, pained moans had stopped. It was just silence, broken by my heavy breathing and the squelch of mud. It was a sacred kind of quiet, like we were in our own little world. The trap was stuck fast. I dug for what felt like an hour, managing only to free one side. My knife was dull and my fingers were losing all feeling. The sun was starting its slow arc toward midday and the warmth it provided was negligible. I was about to give up, to admit defeat and go get the rifle. Then she did something. She didn't move. She couldn't. But she turned her head just slightly and her nose, cold and wet, nuzzled my hand. It was such a small gesture. A wild animal in the worst pain of its life had just reached out, not in aggression, not in fear, in something else. Trust, maybe, gratitude, it didn't matter what you called it. It was a connection. A bridge of understanding that passed between a man and a beast, a fleeting moment of pure, honest contact. It was a thank you. And I knew, in that instant, I would move heaven and earth to save her. I worked with a frantic energy. I started bracing the rope against my shoulder, pulling with all my weight. My boots slipped in the mud and I fell backward, landing hard on my back, the wind knocked out of me. I lay there for a moment, staring up at the gray-white sky, feeling the cold mud soak through my jacket. I could hear her heavy breathing, her heart hammering in her chest. I got up, my body aching, and tried again. I wrapped the rope around my hands, dug my heels in, and pulled. I strained until my vision went blurry and my muscles screamed in protest. A groan escaped my lips, a sound of pure exertion. Nothing. I was about to try again when I heard the sound of an engine, a truck. I looked up and my heart sank. It was the county truck. A man named Earl got out, a thick, unlit cigar clamped between his teeth. He was the sort of man who never smiled and always had a comment about everything. "Well, well, well," he drawled, walking over. "If it ain't John Dawson playin' with the wildlife. What in the blazes are you doin', boy?" I explained the situation, my words tumbling over each other as I pointed at the poor cow. Earl just stared at me, then at her, then at the mess I had made in the mud. He let out a long, low whistle. "You're an idiot," he said matter-of-factly. "You know that, right? That's a feral cow. She ain't worth a plug nickel. Her meat will be tough and she's probably diseased. What you got there is a pile of vet bills and a lot of wasted time. Why would you do something so plumb stupid?" I just looked at her. She was looking at me. I didn't have a good answer, not one that would make sense to a man like Earl. He only saw the bottom line. "Because I can't," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Because I just can't." Earl shook his head, spitting a bit of tobacco juice into the mud. He walked back to his truck and reached into the bed. He came back with a heavy-duty steel pry bar and a pair of thick gloves. Without a word, he knelt in the mud beside me. He wedged the bar into the trap's mechanism. He didn't look at me or the cow. He just grunted, put his weight on the bar, and heaved. The rusty iron groaned in protest. He repositioned, threw his shoulder into it again. And this time, with a sickening screech of metal, the jaws of the trap sprang open. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his coveralls. "I ain't doing it for you," he said gruffly. "I'm doing it to put an end to this pitiful spectacle. You get her seen to, you hear? I ain't got time to come back and bury her for you." He got in his truck and drove away without another word. I didn't even have time to thank him. I knelt back down beside her. The pressure was gone. Her leg, a mess of mangled flesh and splintered bone, was free. She tried to get up, but she was too weak. She just looked at me, her eyes full of a pain that I could feel in my own bones. I wrapped my arms around her, as much to comfort myself as to comfort her. I had no idea how I was going to get her back to the ranch. She couldn't walk. My truck was miles away. I started to feel the cold again, a deep, bone-deep exhaustion that settled into me. I had done the right thing, I thought. I had made a choice, one based on compassion. But as I sat there holding a dying, wild cow in a field of mud, I felt the crushing weight of the consequences of that choice. My hands were raw, my back was screaming, and I was out of options. And that's when something extraordinary started to happen. I sat there with the rough, matted hide of that wild cow pressed against my chest, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't on the verge of tears. Not from sadness, not even from the biting cold that had settled into my bones like a permanent resident. It was from pure, unadulterated exhaustion. I felt like I'd just wrestled a bear and lost, and the only prize was a broken animal that I couldn't move. The sun was a pale, watery orb in the sky, offering no warmth at all. It was an hour past noon, I guessed. I had been out here since dawn, and I had absolutely nothing to show for it but a head full of doubts and a heart full of regret. I was a fool, just like Earl said. A sentimental fool. The cow, surprisingly, was quiet. She had stopped her mournful lowing and was just lying there, her big, brown eyes half-lidded. She was breathing shallowly, and I could feel the weak, rapid fluttering of her heart against my arm. The leg was a horror show. The bone was splintered, the flesh was torn and black with infection. It needed a vet. It needed surgery. It needed a miracle. I couldn't just leave her, but I couldn't carry her. I couldn't drag her. That would only cause her more pain and infection. I had to get my truck, but what then? How was I supposed to get a 200-pound cow into the bed of a pickup truck with a broken leg? It was an impossible situation. The practical part of my brain, the part that had been silenced for a few hours, was screaming at me. This was a disaster. I was going to sink my ranch over a dying, feral cow. Then I heard it, a low rumble different from the sounds of the wind and the creek. It was the sound of a heavy vehicle, but it wasn't Earl's truck. It was a diesel engine, a big one. I craned my neck and saw a cloud of blue smoke rising over the hill to the south. A few moments later, a massive, old, rust-red truck with a flatbed on the back crested the ridge. It was Old Man Henderson's truck. He was as ancient as the hills, and his eyesight was going, but he still ran the biggest ranch in the county. He pulled up, the air brakes hissing like a giant snake. He was alone. He shut off the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. He opened the creaky door and lowered himself to the ground with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had earned every ache and pain he had. He was wearing a battered, sweat-stained Stetson and a thick, oilskin coat. He walked over to me, his boots squelching in the mud. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the cow, then at me, then at the mess we had made. He pulled a flask from his coat pocket, took a long swig of what I guessed was whiskey, and offered it to me. I took it, grateful for the burn that seared my throat and warmed my chest. "I was on my way to town," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Saw your horse tied to the fence from the ridge. Figured you were in a spot of trouble. Then I saw Earl's truck driving away, and I knew the trouble was with you." "He helped me get the trap off her," I said, my voice sounding small and hoarse. "Earl, that son of a bitch has a heart after all," Henderson said with a chuckle that rattled his chest. "What's the plan, John?" "I don't have one," I admitted, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I couldn't leave her." He nodded slowly. He knelt down with a grunt and examined the cow's leg. She flinched, but she was too weak to do more. Henderson winced. "That's a nasty break," he said. "Gonna take a lot of work, might not make it." He looked up at me, his eyes piercing and clear despite his age. "You know what you're getting into, boy. This ain't just a vet bill. This is months of nursing. She might never be fit for the herd again. She might always be a three-legged burden." "I know," I said, and the words came out with more conviction than I felt. Henderson stared at me for a long moment. He was a man of few words, and he didn't waste them on nonsense. He seemed to be looking for something in my eyes. Some sign that I was about to buckle. I didn't know what he found, but he must have seen something, because he just nodded again and stood up. "All right," he said, "let's get to work." And that's when the first extraordinary thing happened. Henderson, a man I had known my whole life, a man who was a legend for his tough-as-nails business sense, knelt down, and with a gentleness that was completely at odds with his gruff exterior, began to fashion a makeshift splint for the cow's leg. He took 2 long, straight branches from a nearby willow tree, wrapped them in strips of cloth he tore from his own shirt, and tied them securely around her leg with my rope. He worked with a practiced ease, a skill born of decades of experience. "She's gonna be heavy," he grunted, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "We're gonna have to carry her to the flatbed. It's gonna hurt like hell. You ready?" I looked at the cow. Her eyes were open now, and she was watching us. There was no fear in them, not anymore, just a quiet, weary acceptance. She knew we were trying to help her. I nodded, and we got to work. Each of us took a shoulder, and on the count of 3 we lifted her. She let out a sharp, pained bellow, but we didn't stop. We carried her, stumbling and slipping in the mud, the short distance to Henderson's truck. It was the longest, most agonizing walk of my life. Every step was a battle, and every pained gasp from the cow was a knife in my gut. We finally got her onto the flatbed, and Henderson secured her with ropes, making sure she was comfortable. He drove us back to my ranch, a slow, bumpy ride that felt like an eternity. I sat in the back of the cab, watching the world go by, listening to the sound of the cow's labored breathing and the hum of the diesel engine. I thought about Bate. She was going to be furious. I had left this morning without a word, and now I was coming back with a wild animal and a mountain of debt. When we got to the ranch, Bate was standing on the porch, a dish towel in her hand, a look of pure, unadulterated shock on her face. She stared at the flatbed, at the pathetic, broken cow, and then at me. I saw her expression shift from shock to disbelief to a weary resignation that broke my heart. She didn't say a word. She just shook her head slowly and went back inside. Henderson helped me get the cow into the barn. We cleared out a stall, laid down a thick bed of fresh hay, and moved her into it. She was trembling, but the warmth of the barn seemed to soothe her. Her eyes were closing. She was drifting off into a state of shock. Henderson looked at me, his face grim. "I'll call the vet," he said. "Doc Miller. He owes me a favor. Tell him I'll cover the cost of the call-out. The rest is on you, son." He clapped me on the shoulder, a surprisingly firm grip for such an old man. "You did a good thing today, John. A right good thing. But doing good things ain't always easy. Remember that." He left, leaving me alone in the barn with the cow and the crushing weight of my own decisions. I sat down on a bale of hay, exhausted, emotionally drained, and completely spent. I just stared at her. She was sleeping now, her breathing more regular. The leg was a mess, but it was clean. Henderson's shirt strips were white against the dark, matted hair. The vet, Doc Miller, arrived an hour later, a wiry man with a gruff demeanor and a black leather bag. He took one look at the cow and let out a low whistle. He was blunt, just like Earl had been, but his tone was more professional than judgmental. "You're out of your mind, Dawson," he said, shaking his head as he examined the leg. "This is a compound fracture. It's badly infected. She's already running a fever. She's in a state of severe shock and malnourishment. I can't work miracles, you know." "I know," I said, my voice cracking. "Just do what you can." He sighed heavily. He cleaned the wound, a grueling process that took over an hour. He gave her a powerful antibiotic and a shot for the pain. He straightened the leg as best he could and put it in a proper splint, a heavy, plaster-like thing that looked like it weighed a ton. "The bone will heal," he said, "but it'll be a slow process. She'll be lame for the rest of her life. She'll never be able to run with the herd again. She's a pet now, John, not livestock. You sure you're ready for that?" I didn't answer. He packed up his bag and left, muttering something about cowboys and their soft hearts. I stayed in the barn. I don't know how long I sat there. The sun went down and the barn grew cold and dark. Bate came out once, bringing me a sandwich and a cup of coffee. She didn't say a word. She just placed them on the hay bale next to me, gave my shoulder a brief, gentle squeeze, and went back inside. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't anger either. It was understanding. A silent acknowledgement that she knew I had to do this, even if she didn't agree. I didn't eat. I couldn't. I just watched the cow, my cow. She was sleeping peacefully now, her side rising and falling with each deep, steady breath. For a while I felt a sense of calm, a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in weeks. I had done what I felt was right. I had made a choice based on compassion, and I had seen it through. But as the hours passed and the cold seeped deeper into my bones, the doubts started to creep back in. Was it really compassion, or was it just foolish sentimentality? What would happen when I couldn't pay the bank? What would happen to Bate and the kids when we lost everything? What was a man without his ranch, without his pride? I had a responsibility to my family, and I had thrown it away for a broken-down cow. I was a failure. I had chosen a wild animal over my own family's future. The thought was so dark, so utterly devastating, that I almost got up and walked out of the barn. I almost took my rifle and ended it all right then and there. Not the cow. Me. It was that feeling of complete and utter hopelessness that I was convinced I couldn't escape from. But I didn't move. I was too tired, too broken. I just sat there in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside and the steady breathing of the cow. I was at my lowest point. I had nothing left. No hope. No plan. No future. And then on the second night, something truly extraordinary happened. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a sign from God. It was just a tiny, almost imperceptible thing. I had fallen asleep, my head lolled back against the hay bale. I was woken by a soft, wet nuzzling against my hand. I opened my eyes and saw the cow. She had shifted her position in the stall and had stretched her head out through the slats of the gate. Her nose was pressed against my palm, and she was looking at me with her big, brown eyes. There was no fear in them, no pain, just a quiet, profound gratitude. She was thanking me. That was the message in her eyes. I felt a lump form in my throat. It wasn't a huge gesture. It didn't solve any of my problems. But in that moment, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long, long time, hope, a fragile, flickering ember of it. And as I looked at her, I knew that I wasn't alone. I had her. I had this strange, broken animal that I had saved. And maybe, just maybe, she had saved me too. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and small, fragile victories. The cow, who I'd started to call Blue for the strange, almost blue tinge to her dark hide, became the center of my world. Bait and the kids brought me meals out to the barn. My son, a quiet boy of 12, would sit with me in the evenings, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and pity. He asked me 100 questions. Why did you do it, Dad? Is she going to live? Are we going to go broke? I couldn't answer him honestly. I didn't know the answers myself. The bank called on the third day. The manager, a humorless man named Mr. Sterling, was not impressed by my tale of compassion. He spoke in clipped, professional tones, reminding me of my obligations. "Your payment is due, Mr. Dawson," he said. "We can't extend you any more credit. Your livestock numbers are down and your operating costs are up. It's a very precarious situation." I hung up the phone, my hand shaking. The weight of it all was crushing. The medication for Blue was expensive. Doc Miller's bill was staggering. And we were still losing cattle. The cold, wet spring had brought a wave of respiratory infections through the herd, and we'd already lost 2 more calves. The future was a dark, bleak tunnel, and I couldn't see the light at the end of it. But I kept going. Every morning I'd be out in the barn before sunrise, changing Blue's bandages, cleaning her stall, and talking to her in a low, steady voice. She was a good patient. She never complained. She took her medicine without a fuss. And slowly, agonizingly, she started to get better. The infection cleared up, the fever subsided. And she began to eat with more enthusiasm. The strength started to return to her legs, and she would even try to stand. A heartbreakingly hopeful act that often ended with her collapsing back into the hay. I became obsessed. I would spend hours in the barn, reading old vet manuals, trying to find anything that would help her. I built her a more comfortable bed, a deep, soft nest of hay and old blankets. I talked to her about everything. I told her about my fears, my hopes, my regrets. She just listened, her big, brown eyes watching me with an unnerving intensity. It was on the 8th day that the first murmur of something unusual started. I was out checking the fence line again, a monotonous chore that I did every few days. My mind was elsewhere, on Blue, on the bank, on the endless cycle of worry. I was so lost in thought that I didn't notice the sound at first. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like a distant bass drum. I pulled up Rusty and listened. The sound was coming from the north, from the direction of Eagle Creek, where I had found Blue. I rode towards it, my curiosity piqued. The thumping grew louder, and then I heard it, a chorus of low, grunting bellows. I crested a small rise and looked down into the valley. What I saw made my blood run cold. The entire valley was alive with movement. A massive herd of wild cattle, maybe 100 strong, was moving. They weren't running. They were walking in a single, slow, deliberate line. They were heading north, away from my ranch, their heads down, their movement almost purposeful. I had never seen anything like it. The wild cattle were solitary creatures. They didn't form herds. They were loners skulking in the shadows. To see them gathered like this, moving in unison, was deeply unsettling. It was unnatural. It was wrong. A chill ran down my spine, a primal fear that had nothing to do with the cold. This was something different, something ancient and instinctual. I remembered the old stories my father used to tell me, stories of the land and the creatures that roamed it. He said the animals could sense things that we couldn't. They could feel the tremors in the earth long before we could. They knew when a storm was coming, when the drought was about to break, when the land was about to shift. I had always dismissed those stories as the ramblings of an old man. Now, I wasn't so sure. I turned Rusty around and rode back to the ranch as fast as I could. I told Bate about what I'd seen, my voice trembling. She just looked at me, her face pale and drawn. "I've been feeling it too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's in the air, like a pressure, like the world is holding its breath." That evening I went to check on Blue. I was exhausted both physically and emotionally. I sat down on the hay bale beside her stall and I just looked at her. Her leg was healing, but it was still a long way from being strong. I was starting to feel a sense of despair again. The whole situation was so hopeless. I was fighting a losing battle. I laid my head back against the wood and closed my eyes. I was on the verge of sleep when I felt it, a tap on my shoulder. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. I looked around. I was alone. But then I felt another tap, this one more insistent. It was coming from the stall. I turned and looked at Blue. She was standing. She was on her feet. The splint was still on her leg, but she was standing on it, her weight distributed carefully. She was leaning over the gate, her head tilted, her big brown eyes locked on mine. She was trying to tell me something. I got up, my heart pounding, and walked to the gate. I reached out and put my hand on her nose. It was warm and dry. She made a low, guttural sound in her throat, almost like a purr. And then she turned her head, looking towards the north, towards the valley where I had seen the herd. I followed her gaze. There was nothing there, just the darkening sky and the empty fields. But I felt it then. A deep, rumbling vibration that traveled up through the soles of my boots, through my bones, and into my very soul. It was the sound of the earth moving. It was a low, persistent hum that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I looked back at Blue, and for a fleeting moment I understood. It wasn't just compassion that had made me save her. It was something more, a connection, a bond between me and this wild, broken creature that went beyond reason. I wasn't just saving her. She was saving me. She was showing me the way. She knew something was coming, something big. The next morning the world felt different. The air was crisp and clean, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me for weeks seemed to have lifted, just a little. The humming was gone. I went outside and looked north. The herd was gone. They had moved on. But as I looked at the sky, I saw something that took my breath away. A large flock of birds was circling overhead. Not just any birds. They were eagles, bald eagles. There were dozens of them circling high in the sky, riding the thermals. They weren't hunting. They weren't fighting. They were just watching me, watching my land. It was a sight so majestic and awe-inspiring that I felt tears prick at my eyes. I didn't understand what was happening. I had no explanation for it. But I knew in my gut that something was changing. Something was starting. It was a new beginning, a quiet revolution. And at the center of it all was a broken-down cow named Blue and a rancher who had chosen compassion over profit. That day, Bate came to the barn to find me. She had a strange, almost fearful look in her eyes. "John," she said, her voice trembling, "you need to come see this." She led me out into the yard. The sun was shining, a warm, glorious spring sun that was finally melting the last of the frost. The ground was soft and green, and the land was alive. I could see it in the fields. The grass was sprouting everywhere, a verdant, thick carpet that I hadn't seen in years. The wildflowers were starting to bloom, their colors so bright and vibrant they hurt my eyes. The whole ranch was bursting with life. And then I saw them, a small herd of deer grazing peacefully in the lower meadow. They didn't spook when I walked out. They just looked up at me, their eyes calm and unafraid. A family of foxes was playing near the old stone wall, their kits tumbling and chasing each other in the long grass. A large, sleek coyote, the kind that normally would be a threat to our livestock, was sitting on a distant hill, watching over the scene like a guardian. It was a paradise. My land had become a sanctuary. The animals were coming from everywhere. They were coming to my ranch. They were all looking at Blue. It was as if she was a beacon, a symbol of hope and safety, and they were all seeking refuge in her shadow. I knew then, in a way I couldn't explain, that something miraculous was unfolding. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the cattle. It was about the land. It was about the connection between all living things, and it was about me. I had made a choice, a selfless choice, and the land was rewarding me, not with riches, not with status, but with something far more precious. It was giving me a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. The extraordinary wasn't one single event. It was the quiet, persistent miracle of life itself, returning to a place where it was welcomed. It was the bond I had forged with a wild animal. It was the hope that had rekindled in my heart. I knew I wasn't out of the woods yet. The bank was still looming and the challenges were still there. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't alone. I was part of something bigger. I was part of the land. And as I walked back towards the barn, my hand extended to Blue, I knew everything was going to be all right. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into a spring of such profound beauty and abundance that it felt like living inside a painting. My ranch, the one I had been so close to losing, had become a living tapestry of life. The grass grew so tall and thick it brushed against Rusty's belly. The creek, which had been a muddy torrent, was now a clear, sparkling ribbon of water, teeming with fish. The air was filled with the sound of birdsong, a constant, joyful chorus that seemed to celebrate every single sunrise. The animals that had come to my land didn't leave. They established their territories, carving out a peaceful existence alongside each other and my small herd of cattle. The deer grazed in the lower meadows. The foxes made their dens in the old stone walls. The coyote, whom I'd started to call the sentinel, kept watch from the hilltop, a silent guardian of this new peace. And at the center of it all was Blue. Her leg was healing, slowly but surely. She could walk on it now, a clumsy, limping gait, but she was walking. Her coat was starting to grow back, a rich, glossy brown that gleamed in the sun. She had put on weight, and she was no longer the scrawny, pathetic creature I had found in the trap. She was regal. She was beautiful. She was the queen of my sanctuary. The bank didn't call again. I don't know why. Maybe Mr. Sterling was waiting for me to fail. Maybe he was just too busy to bother. But the silence gave me a sliver of breathing room, a chance to catch my breath. I was still deeply in debt, but I had something I hadn't had before: hope. The land was providing. The rain came at the right times. The garden was flourishing. I felt like I was being watched over, not by a vengeful God, but by the gentle, forgiving spirit of the land itself. The first real test of this new reality came from an unexpected quarter. One afternoon, I saw a plume of dust rising from the road. It was a truck, a big, fancy one with a shimmering paint job and a trailer in tow. It was driven by a man I recognized instantly, Harrison Caldwell. He was a land developer from the city, a man who had been trying to buy up land in the valley for years. He was known for his aggressive tactics and his complete disregard for the rural way of life. He pulled up to the ranch house and got out, a smug smile plastered on his face. He was wearing a suit and shiny shoes that were completely out of place on a dirt road. I met him on the porch. He didn't waste any time. "John," he said, extending a hand that I didn't take. "Good to see you. I've been hearing some amazing things. I heard you've done something quite extraordinary with your land. They say you've created a wildlife sanctuary. I've seen the animals on the drive-in, truly remarkable." "It's just a ranch," I said, my voice flat, "same as it's always been." "Come now, John," he said, his smile widening. "Don't be modest. This is a gold mine. I want to make you an offer, a serious offer, one that will set you and your family up for life. I want to buy your land." My heart sank. Of course. That's what this was about. He had seen the miraculous transformation of my land and wanted to exploit it. He wanted to turn my sanctuary into another housing development, a golf course, a monument to his own ambition. "I'm not selling," I said. He chuckled, a condescending sound that made my blood boil. "John, be realistic. I've seen your books. I know you're in trouble. Your debt is astronomical. I'm offering you an escape. I'm offering you a way out. You could retire to the coast. You could live a life of luxury. Don't be a fool." He named a price. It was a staggering sum, far more than my land was worth in any logical sense. It was a number that could have erased every single one of my debts and left me with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. It was everything I had ever dreamed of. It was the answer to every single one of my problems. But it was the wrong answer. I looked past him across my fields. I saw the deer, their heads raised, watching us. I saw the foxes, their kits tumbling in the grass. I saw the sentinel standing tall on his hill. They were all looking at me, and I knew they were all asking the same question. "Are you going to abandon us, John?" I thought about Blue. I thought about the choice I had made, the choice that had set all of this in motion. I had chosen compassion over profit. I had chosen life. Could I really undo all of that now? Could I really take the money and walk away, leaving all of these creatures to be bulldozed and driven away? Could I betray the trust that they had placed in me? "No," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm not selling, not now, not ever." He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "You're making a terrible mistake, John. This is a once-in-a-lifetime offer. I'm being generous." "It's not about generosity," I said. "It's about what's right." He shook his head, his face hard. "You're a fool," he said. "A sentimental fool. You're going to lose everything, and when you do, don't come crying to me." He got back in his truck and drove away, his tires spinning on the gravel. I watched the cloud of dust settle on the road, and I felt a profound sense of peace. I had made the right choice. It wasn't the easy choice. It was the right one. That evening I sat on the porch with Bate. She didn't ask me what Caldwell had wanted. She already knew. She just took my hand in hers and squeezed it. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "That was a brave thing you did. You stood up for what you believe in." "I couldn't do it," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't sell them out." "I know," she said. "That's why I love you." We sat in silence, watching the sun set over the valley. The colors were magnificent, a breathtaking tapestry of orange, red, and purple. I looked out over my land, my sanctuary, and I felt a profound sense of belonging. I wasn't just a rancher anymore. I was a guardian, a steward. I was part of something that was far bigger than myself. The next morning I went to the barn to see Blue. She was standing in the middle of her stall, her head held high. She was looking better than ever. I walked up to the gate and she nuzzled my hand, her warm breath on my skin. She made a low, purring sound, a sound that had become so familiar to me. It was a sound of trust, of affection, of gratitude. I opened the gate and stepped into the stall. I put my arm around her neck and I leaned my head against her. For a long moment we just stood there together, a man and a cow, sharing a moment of perfect peace. It was a simple thing, an ordinary thing, but for me it was everything. I knew my problems weren't over. The debt was still there. The challenges were still there. But I also knew something that I hadn't known before. I knew that I was strong enough to face them. I had learned that compassion wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. It was a force that could move mountains, that could heal wounds, that could create miracles. The land was still healing. The animals were still thriving. And I was still there, in the middle of it all, a humble rancher who had made a choice that had changed everything. It was a choice that had cost me a lot, but it had given me even more. I walked out of the barn and I saw the sentinel. He was on his hill watching over the valley. He was watching over me. He let out a single, long, mournful howl. It wasn't a sound of sadness. It was a sound of celebration, a sound of hope. I smiled. I looked up at the sky and I felt the sun on my face. It was going to be a good day. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time I was ready to face it. I had my family, I had my land, and I had blue. I also had the eagles. They were back, circling in their silent vigil. They were watching over my land. They were a symbol of the resilience of life. They were a reminder that even in the darkest of times there is always hope. They were a sign that the extraordinary could happen if you were just willing to believe. I walked back to the house, my heart full. It wasn't a neat, tidy ending. It was a beginning, a story of a man, a cow, and the land that had brought them together. It was a story of compassion, of hope, and of the extraordinary power of a simple choice. It was a story that would be told for generations, whispered on the wind and sung by the river. It was a story of the rancher who chose compassion over profit and of the extraordinary things that happened on his land. And it was only just beginning.